Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming back to this channel. Before we begin, make sure you're safe, because tonight's story isn't just a horror story, it's real. On this channel, we discuss dark, mysterious, and unexplained events. Now, let's begin. The last voice heard from this village wasn't human. In the early 2000s, emergency dispatch logs recorded a final transmission from a remote village shortly before it went silent forever. The voice on that recording was clear, calm, and unmistakably not human, according to those who later reviewed it. The village sat in a low valley surrounded by forested hills, reachable only by a single dirt road that often washed out during heavy rain. Fewer than 60 people lived there, most working as subsistence farmers or forest laborers. They had electricity, a shared radio system, and limited cell reception that faded after sunset. For years, nearby communities described the village as quiet but normal. There were no known conflicts, no criminal activity, and no history of violence. The only unusual detail mentioned repeatedly was the village radio. Locals said it was never turned off, even at night. In 2003, a regional communications technician named Bima Kurnia was assigned to inspect rural radio networks after complaints of signal interference. Bima was 35 years old and had worked with emergency dispatch systems for over a decade. His task was routine: travel to the village, test the radio equipment, and resolve any transmission issues. Bima arrived just after midday. The village appeared calm and intact, with no visible signs of distress. Children played near the road, and adults worked in nearby fields. Several residents greeted him politely, but avoided conversation longer than necessary. When Bima asked about the interference reports, people exchanged uneasy looks. One older man eventually said the radio had started talking back at night. He laughed afterward, as if embarrassed, and refused to explain further. Bima dismissed the comment as a misunderstanding caused by static or overlapping frequencies. Rural radio systems often picked up stray signals, especially at night. He unloaded his equipment and began inspecting the central radio hut near the village square. The radio hut was small, poorly ventilated, and noticeably warm inside. The main transmitter showed signs of frequent use, far more than expected for a village of that size. Bima noted that the system was left powered on continuously, despite instructions to shut it down overnight. As he ran diagnostics, Bima noticed something unusual. The radio was transmitting on multiple frequencies simultaneously, some of which were not assigned to any regional service. The signal strength fluctuated in a steady rhythm, rising and falling every few seconds. Bima asked a nearby villager if the radio had been modified recently. The man shook his head and said no one touched it anymore. When pressed, he added that the radio worked better if left alone. That evening, Bima planned to stay overnight in the village before completing his report. As dusk settled, the atmosphere changed subtly. Conversations ended early, doors closed, and lights dimmed across the village. By nightfall, the streets were empty. Inside his guest room, Bima monitored the radio feed using his portable receiver. At first, he heard only low static and distant interference. Then, just after 9, a voice came through. It spoke slowly and clearly, using the local dialect with perfect pronunciation. The voice did not identify itself. It repeated a single phrase, calmly and patiently, as if waiting for someone to respond. Bima adjusted the receiver, assuming he was picking up a broadcast from another region. But the signal strength indicated the source was extremely close. The voice did not distort or fade, no matter how he tuned the device. Over the next hour, the voice continued speaking. It called out names, one at a time, pausing between each. Bima recognized some of the names from earlier introductions. Each time a name was spoken, a faint click sounded on the transmission, as if something had acknowledged the response. Around midnight, Bima heard movement outside. Footsteps passed slowly beneath his window, followed by the quiet opening and closing of doors. He looked outside, but saw nothing beyond darkness and stillness. The radio crackled again, and the voice changed. It lowered in pitch and spoke a final sentence that froze Bima in place. According to his later statement, the cadence was wrong, too even, too deliberate, like a machine imitating speech. Then the transmission cut abruptly to silence. That was the last recorded signal ever received from the village. As soon as the transmission ended, the silence felt heavier than before. Bhima waited several minutes, expecting the radio to resume normal static, but nothing came through. The receiver remained active, yet the signal was completely dead. Unable to ignore the unease, Bhima stepped outside. The village was dark, with only a few dim lights visible behind closed doors. The air felt still and dense, carrying a faint metallic scent similar to overheated electronics. He walked toward the central square, calling out softly to see if anyone was awake. No one answered. Houses that had been occupied earlier were now locked from the outside, their interiors dark and quiet. At the radio hut, Bhima found the door standing open. Inside, the equipment was powered on, but several indicator lights were flickering erratically. The transmitter showed activity despite the lack of outgoing signal, as if it was listening rather than broadcasting. Bhima checked the system logs. According to the timestamps, the radio had been active throughout the night for months, transmitting short bursts at irregular intervals. The content logs, however, were empty. No recordings should have existed. As he stood there, the radio came alive again. This time, the sound was lower and more distorted. The voice returned, but it no longer spoke in full words. It produced tones that rose and fell in patterns, almost like speech stripped of meaning. Bhima felt an immediate pressure in his ears and a wave of nausea. Through the open door, he noticed movement at the edge of the square. Figures were emerging from the darkness, walking slowly and silently toward the radio hut. Their movements were calm, synchronized, and unhurried. Bhima recognized several villagers. Their faces were blank, their eyes unfocused, as if they were sleepwalking. None of them acknowledged him as they passed, all moving toward the sound. Panicking, Bhima shouted for them to stop. No one reacted. He grabbed the transmitter controls, attempting to power the system down manually. The switches resisted briefly, then snapped into place. The voice stopped. The villagers froze mid-step. For a brief moment, the silence was absolute. Then every light in the hut went out at once, plunging the square into darkness. Something spoke again, but not through the radio. The sound came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground and the walls. It was the same cadence Bhima had heard earlier, but now deeper and closer. He could not understand the words, yet he felt certain they were directed at him. The villagers began turning toward Bhima. He ran. Bhima fled back toward the guest house, barely able to see where he was going. Behind him, he heard doors opening across the village, followed by slow, steady footsteps joining together. Inside his room, he barricaded the door and hid beneath the window. His portable receiver crackled weakly, even though it was switched off. Faint tones pulsed through it, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. Just before dawn, the sounds stopped. When Bhima finally emerged, the village was empty. Every house stood open. Belongings were left behind. Cooking fires were cold but recently used. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, and no damage. Only silence. Bhima contacted regional authorities immediately and waited by the road until help arrived. Search teams later combed the area for days, expanding into the surrounding forest. They found no villagers, no tracks leading away, and no evidence of mass movement. Investigators recovered the radio equipment and reviewed the dispatch recordings. The final transmission was confirmed, but audio specialists could not classify the voice. Analysis reports stated that its pitch, timing, and modulation did not match any known human speech patterns. Officially, the villagers were declared missing due to unknown causes. The site was abandoned and the road was closed. Bhima resigned from his position shortly afterward and refused further interviews. Years later, when asked about the final sentence the voice spoke, Bhima admitted he never translated it. He said he understood it instantly, and that was what terrified him most. The voice had not been calling them. It had been answering. In the months that followed, the disappearance of the village was quietly absorbed into administrative records. Maps were updated, supply routes were canceled, and the dirt road leading into the valley was marked as closed due to safety concerns. Official statements avoided speculation. The villagers were listed as missing, with no indication of foul play. Without bodies or witnesses beyond Bima, there was no case to pursue and no timeline to establish. Behind closed doors, investigators continued reviewing the radio evidence. Audio engineers isolated the final transmission and slowed it down, filtered it, and compared it against known speech patterns. The results were consistent across multiple labs. The voice used phonemes similar to human language, but the timing between sounds was unnaturally precise. There were no breaths, no emotional variation, and no irregularities typical of human speech. One analyst noted that the voice behaved more like a response system than a broadcast. It did not speak until someone else transmitted first. Each phrase aligned perfectly with incoming signals from the village radios, almost as if it were replying. Archived dispatch logs revealed a disturbing pattern. For several months before the disappearance, the village radio transmitted brief signals every night at nearly the same time. The outgoing messages were short and repetitive, usually consisting of greetings or roll call confirmations. Each time the village transmitted, the unknown voice replied. No record showed the voice initiating contact. It only responded after being addressed. Investigators interviewed nearby communities again, this time focusing on the radio rather than the villagers. Older residents admitted that the radio system had been installed decades earlier, replacing an older communication method that no one wanted to describe in detail. One elder eventually stated that the radio was meant to listen, not to speak. He claimed the village used to perform nightly check-ins long before modern equipment existed. When technology changed, the ritual stayed the same. According to him, the voice had always been there. The radio had simply given it a clearer way to answer. Authorities dismissed the statement as folklore and removed it from the final report. Still, the village radio equipment was never reused. It was dismantled and stored in a secured facility, where it reportedly powered on several times without being connected to electricity. Those incidents were not officially logged. Bima attempted to move on with his life, but the experience followed him. He avoided radios, emergency scanners, and even simple electronic devices that produced static. He refused to sleep in silence, keeping music playing quietly to drown out any unexpected sound. Years later, he agreed to one final interview under the condition that it not be published immediately. During that recording, he clarified the final sentence the voice had spoken. It had not issued a threat or a command. It had said thank you. Bima explained that the villagers had been responding for generations, acknowledging something they could not see but understood needed to be answered. When the responses stopped, the voice had adjusted. It no longer needed the radio. The valley remains empty today. No new settlements have been built, and travelers are warned away without explanation. At night, nearby radio towers sometimes register brief incoming signals from that direction, though no transmitter is listed there anymore. Technicians label the interference as atmospheric noise and move on. Those who listen closely say it still waits, and it is still listening. The warning hidden in that old dashcam file. A forgotten dashcam file sat on an aging memory card for years before anyone bothered to play it, and the warning, recorded in those shaky seconds, pushed investigators back toward a case they thought had ended. The file came from a car abandoned in a storage lot behind a rural towing company, and the message inside it raised questions that no one could answer cleanly. Ryland Corbett was a 34-year-old landscape electrician who drove long routes across scattered mountain towns. He kept a careful routine so he could reach each job site before sunrise, and he relied on an old dashcam mounted beneath his rearview mirror to track mileage and protect himself from liability. Ryland preferred quiet roads, and he often took a narrow side highway that ran between pine forest and empty service pullouts. His friends said he liked that road because it gave him time to think without interruption. On a cool night in early autumn, Rylan left a job site later than normal. He told a coworker he planned to drive straight home rather than stay in town. He looked tired but steady, and he mentioned nothing about trouble. He bought fuel at a station near the highway entrance, grabbed a bottle of water, then headed toward the dim mountain road he used every week. His last confirmed call came through his work phone at roughly 9, and he said he expected to arrive home in 2 hours. He never arrived. A county deputy found his truck the next morning parked at a slight angle on the shoulder of a forest stretch that saw little overnight travel. The engine was cold, the doors were locked, and Ryland's tools sat neatly in the truck bed. There were no signs of a struggle and no indication he left the truck willingly. Search teams combed the woods for 2 days, but found nothing beyond faint footprints leading a short distance into the trees. Those prints vanished in a patch of dry needles where the ground was too firm to hold detail. The truck remained in evidence storage for months until the case grew cold. Eventually, it was transferred to a private towing lot. The dashcam stayed attached inside the cab, and no one checked the memory card again until nearly 8 years later when the towing company changed ownership. During a routine inventory sweep, an employee named Soren Lay removed the old dashcam because it rattled when he shut the door. He decided to check the card out of curiosity, and the first playable clip froze him in place. The file began with ordinary night driving. The headlights cast narrow beams over cracked asphalt as the forest shifted around the truck. A low hum filled the microphone, likely from the engine. Ryland's voice appeared once near the start, and he sounded annoyed about a vehicle that seemed to be trailing him for several miles. His tone was controlled, yet it carried an edge of confusion. He asked if the driver behind him needed to pass, then muttered that the vehicle kept fading out of view and returning again. A few minutes into the video, the headlights from a trailing vehicle appeared at the far edge of the frame. The light glared briefly, then vanished as if the driver dipped their beams or pulled back suddenly. The dashcam's date stamp suggested it matched the time frame of Ryland's disappearance, though the digits were partially corrupted. About 20 seconds later, Ryland whispered that he saw the trailing vehicle again through his side mirror. His voice tightened as he said the truck behind him had a broken fog light on the passenger side. That detail mattered because similar reports surfaced around that same highway during preceding months. The recording shifted as the truck rounded a bend. The microphone picked up a metallic rattle from the passenger door, followed by a faint rustling sound that seemed out of place. Analysts later believed the rustling came from something brushing along the truck exterior. Ryland's breathing quickened, and he said someone had stepped onto the road ahead. The camera captured no figure, yet the truck slowed sharply. Ryland spoke again, stating that he recognized something about the person's movement. His next sentence was barely audible, and investigators could not confirm whether he said the word drugged or dragged. The audio fractured when the trailing headlights suddenly filled the dashcam frame. The glare overwhelmed the sensor, and the clip flickered between brightness and near darkness. Ryland cursed under his breath and said he would pull into the next service turnout. The microphone caught the heavy thump of the truck hitting loose gravel. The truck angled toward the right shoulder, where a small turnout opened beneath leaning pines. The camera tilted as if the mounting bracket loosened. The final 2 seconds before the cut showed a blurred outline near the driver's side window. That outline appeared tall, with narrow shoulders, though the frame lacked enough clarity to define facial details. The dashcam file ended abruptly. The final second recorded a strange 3-tone pattern that technicians believed came from the dashcam's internal warning system. Older models produced that sound during sudden vibration, but the pattern also triggered if the device detected manual interference. The combination of glare, sudden movement, and the abrupt cutoff suggested someone may have touched the dashcam before the recording terminated. Investigators re-examined witness reports from the night Ryland vanished. Several drivers traveling the mountain road claimed they saw a dark truck with a broken passenger fog light weaving across lanes. One driver described the truck slowing near the service turnout where Ryland's vehicle was later found. None of the witnesses could identify the driver, and the truck disappeared before deputies reached the area. A retired ranger who lived near the bend reported hearing a loud engine rev shortly after 9:30, followed by quiet for nearly an hour. The discovery of the dashcam file renewed interest in the case. Investigators mapped the route Ryland took that night and matched his comments in the clip to mile markers along the forest road. The moment he mentioned the broken fog light aligned with a curve known for concealment due to heavy tree cover. The point where he slowed matched the turnout used historically by maintenance crews who serviced power lines. That turnout had a narrow footpath leading deeper into the woods, though the path was overgrown by the time search teams inspected it again. The dashcam audio mentioning recognition gained particular interest. Ryland had completed several contracts in the same region during the months before his disappearance, and he frequently worked near remote properties. Detectives theorized that he may have encountered the same vehicle or person previously. His coworker mentioned an incident where Ryland complained about someone idling along a worksite access road late at night. Ryland believed the driver observed him for several minutes before speeding away. That report never escalated because Ryland dismissed it after a few days. Advanced audio processing on the final seconds of the clip revealed a faint background voice overlapping Ryland's last words. The voice spoke too quietly to capture full phrases, though analysts isolated a short fragment that sounded like "keep him there" or "keep it there." They could not determine if the voice came from inside the truck or through the partially open window. The possibility of a second person near the vehicle strengthened the idea that Ryland had pulled over because he believed he could talk to whoever stepped into the road. The three-tone warning pattern at the end of the clip became a focal point. Dashcam specialists explained that the pattern activated when the camera detected physical contact strong enough to tilt the lens. This aligned with the blurred outline near the window. Investigators believed someone reached into the cab or struck the dashcam mount, causing the device to shut off. They compared the timing of the audio cutoff with the impression marks found on the driver's side door, which appeared years earlier during the original inspection. Those marks seemed consistent with someone bracing a hand or tool against the doorframe. Though the dashcam file did not reveal a face or plate number, it provided the clearest sequence of events leading to Ryland's disappearance. It confirmed that he felt watched long before he pulled into the turnout and that someone approached his truck at the exact moment the recording ended. It also established that the trailing vehicle appeared intentionally evasive, repeatedly hiding its lights and adjusting distance. The file now sits in a secure archive at the county office. Investigators revisit it periodically, studying the brief seconds that captured Ryland's warning. They say the clip reflects a man who realized something was wrong, but still believed he could manage the situation. Locals who travel the mountain road at night still talk about the broken fog light that appeared in several witness reports and the possibility that the driver behind it learned the forest well enough to disappear without trace. The warning hidden in that old dashcam file continues to shape how the case is understood, offering a glimpse into those final moments when headlights, shadows, and a sudden outline at the driver window converged into one unanswered mystery. This dispatch recording reveals a final warning. The tape emerged during a major equipment cleanup in early November 2010 when a junior technician named Corbin Weller sorted an old storage closet in a small mountain dispatch station near a quiet highway. He expected dust and broken headsets, yet he found a battered reel marked Night Alert with a smeared date that suggested years of neglect. Corbin planned to toss anything unreadable, but the careful handwriting on the label felt intentional enough to keep him curious. He waited until his shift ended before loading the tape into an aging player in the break room. The audio crackled twice before locking into a clear channel that carried the steady voice of dispatcher Rowan Pike, who had worked overnight duty for years without incident. His calm tone described routine conditions on the ridge road with dry pavement and light wind that made the route easy for travelers. A ranger named Tessa Rourke checked in from the overlooked turnout where she monitored late traffic for safety concerns. Her voice carried the relaxed confidence of someone who treated the mountain as familiar ground rather than difficult terrain, even during long, quiet hours. 6 minutes into the recording, Rowan asked about a faint tapping behind her speech that sounded like metal nudged at a slow rhythm under shifting pressure. Tessa paused, then admitted she heard it too, although she believed it came from a loose drainage grate near the turnout that often rattled after dusk. She dismissed the sound as ordinary maintenance trouble while assuring him she would inspect it soon. Rowan accepted her answer, yet the tapping continued with steady timing that broke from typical weather patterns and made him uneasy despite his training. The tape captured a slight tremble in her radio as the tapping grew sharper, as if something heavy pressed against the grate with deliberate force. Rowan told her to stay alert because the pattern felt too precise for random vibration. She agreed while stepping back toward her patrol truck with boots crunching over cold gravel. The microphone picked up her breathing, which turned fast and shallow once the tapping stopped without any fading interval. She whispered that she sensed movement beyond the tree line, though she could not yet identify size or shape. Rowan asked for details, and her answer arrived in a tense, quiet tone that carried controlled fear. She said a tall, narrow figure stood between two pines with a posture that looked too still for any animal she recognized along these routes. She insisted the shape did not sway with the wind and seemed angled toward her position in a watching stance. Rowan instructed her to get inside her vehicle and lock the doors until he contacted the closest ranger for support. She acknowledged him, then moved quickly with clear urgency. Her door slammed on the audio and the engine rumbled through the static as she locked every entry. She reported that the figure now stood behind her truck, though still out of direct light. A slow scrape crept across the microphone like metal dragging on painted steel as something brushed her tailgate. Rowan demanded a clear description once she raised her spotlight toward the rear window. Her breath caught as the beam hit the figure, which shifted instantly toward the forest, with unnatural speed that she described as wrong for any human motion she had seen on duty. The figure vanished among the trees without sound, which unsettled Rowan more than the earlier tapping. He tried to calm her while confirming that backup needed 15 minutes to reach the turnout. The tape held a long, silent stretch, where only the hum of her engine filled the channel. Tessa finally said she felt watched again, though she could not see any movement between the trees because the darkness felt too thick for her spotlight. Rowan kept her talking, so she stayed grounded, but her voice remained strained. A deep thud echoed through the microphone, and she claimed the ground seemed to pulse beneath her boots before she entered the vehicle. Rowan asked her to repeat that because he thought he misheard, but she insisted the soil shifted in a slow wave under the gravel. He tried to rationalize the thud as settling rock common in cold mountain regions, though his tone betrayed doubt. She said the pulse traveled in a direction rather than spreading evenly, which made her believe something moved beneath the turnout. The recording grew distorted as she whispered that the figure returned, though now it stood beside a tree much closer to her passenger door. Rowan called her name with sharp urgency while she scrambled for better visibility through the window. A sudden metallic impact rang through the microphone, followed by a short cry that cut off with chilling abruptness. Static flooded the audio, then dissolved into hollow silence, while the engine continued to idle steadily. Rowan repeated her name several times without response, and finally switched channels to call for immediate assistance. Backup reached the turnout with lights sweeping across frost-covered ground. They found her truck idling with the driver door wide open and her radio placed carefully on the seat. No footprints or drag marks circled the vehicle despite soft frost that should have recorded every movement. The official report suggested she chased a possible trespasser into the forest and became disoriented, which local volunteers quietly disputed after helping with extended searches that revealed no trace of her anywhere near the ridge or the lower trails. Corbin listened to the tape twice more before admitting he felt nervous inside the break room, even with fluorescent lights above him. He believed she encountered a trespasser, but could not explain the absence of tracks or the underground pulse she described with steady clarity. He investigated the drainage grate during his next shift, yet found no height or depth that matched the deep thud carried on the recording. The grate showed no damage and no signs of forced pressure that could create rhythmic tapping. He brought the tape to his supervisor, who sealed it inside a locked archive drawer scheduled for regional review. 2 days later, the drawer held no tape and no sign that it had ever been checked out. The supervisor assumed a filing error, yet Corbin found no similar reel anywhere in the station. His only comfort came from a private digital copy he made during the initial playback out of habit rather than suspicion. During late shifts, he sometimes heard faint tapping under the dispatch floor during quiet hours. He dismissed the sound as old pipes adjusting to cold air, though the taps followed the same slow rhythm he remembered from the tape. Each time the tapping stopped sharply, the room filled with tense silence, identical to the moment before her final warning. Corbin avoided mentioning these incidents because he feared they would sound like imagination rather than observation. Months passed before he rewatched the digital copy and realized something new. The final second before the static carried a soft breath from outside the truck rather than inside. The breath sounded deep, steady, and close to the microphone, as if someone leaned near the open door with calm patience. The breath ended with a faint step that barely registered through the static, but held weight that did not match her lighter movements captured earlier. Years later, the digital copy remains the only surviving record of that night because the original tape never resurfaced. Corbin keeps the file on a single encrypted drive that he rarely opens because the final breath unsettles him more than any other part of the recording. He believes the breath matters because it proves someone stood beside her truck before the static claimed the channel, which means her last fear was not imagined but observed. The quiet truth behind that railroad service tunnel. Dispatch logs from a rural county reportedly flagged a strange pattern that focused on an old tunnel near a maintenance siding. Those logs hinted at a series of calls that described footsteps inside the tunnel when no workers were scheduled to be there. Ferran Coyle was a 36-year-old track inspector who handled routine checks along a tired freight corridor that bordered pine scrub and scattered ranch properties. He arrived before sunrise on a cool morning in late 1999 with a simple plan to confirm reported drainage issues near the north entrance of the tunnel. He expected a quick inspection followed by a standard form filed at the small depot office. He parked his truck near the faded signal tower and slung his gear bag over one shoulder, while the sky turned slowly from deep blue to dull gray. He walked toward the tunnel mouth with the usual confidence of someone who had spent years inside tight places and decaying structures. His boots crunched evenly on gravel that clicked against the rust-stained rails. The plan changed after he spotted a narrow streak of mud across a maintenance door set into the concrete wall beside the entrance. He knew that door should have been sealed 2 months earlier after an internal order directed crews to retire a forgotten tool alcove behind it. The instructions were clear on company records that the alcove had become unsafe after repeated washouts and was not to be opened again. Ferran crouched to study the door and saw fresh scuff marks near the bottom that looked like someone had scraped something heavy across the frame. A thin line of water traced down from the latch and darkened the gravel below. He listened for movement and heard a faint tap that sounded like metal striking stone somewhere inside the tunnel where darkness gathered like a heavy curtain. Witness accounts from workers who had used the tunnel in earlier years mentioned odd sounds during night shifts that resembled a slow dragging rhythm. Those older reports were never confirmed by supervisors and were often dismissed as stress-induced hearing fatigue. Ferran had always believed those stories held small grains of truth that deserved respect. He opened his notebook and wrote a quick timestamp, followed by a simple description of the muddy door. He raised a small portable recorder and pressed the warn button to capture ambient noise that pulsed through the tunnel. The tap grew stronger, as if echoing against a deeper chamber. The sound pattern matched older recordings stored in a dusty cabinet at the depot that he had reviewed the previous winter. Ferran unlatched the maintenance door and stepped inside the alcove that smelled strongly of wet soil and neglected machinery. The beam from his flashlight struck rows of rusted tool hooks lining the walls. Several hooks were empty, even though inventory sheets claimed every item had been removed during the official closure. A slim track wrench lay on the ground near the far corner with a layer of clean grit across half its handle that suggested it had been dropped recently. He examined the floor and found a thin trail of dark sludge that continued toward a narrow gap behind a leaning support panel. The panel looked as if someone had shoved it aside with a steady and deliberate force. Ferran moved closer and felt cool air rising through the gap with slow, steady pulses, like weak breaths drifting through broken stone. He radioed the depot office and reported a possible breach in the sealed alcove. The dispatcher asked him to hold position until a second inspector arrived from a yard 20 miles south. Ferran agreed, yet continued recording his surroundings because the tap inside the tunnel had grown into a hollow knocking pattern that sounded too rhythmic to be wind-driven. He pushed the panel aside and revealed a small cavity that workers had once used to route cables during upgrades that took place in the early 1980s. That cavity appeared larger than official diagrams showed and extended into a sloping passage coated with mud and shattered limestone flakes. He knelt to study the passage and saw faint shoe impressions that curved downward as if someone had walked into the dark without hesitation. Archived reports described a missing crew member who vanished near this tunnel during a severe storm in 1978. Search teams found none of his gear, and investigators noted that his last known position matched the location of the old cable cavity. Supervisors later wrote that he had likely slipped into rising runoff waters, then been carried beyond reach. Ferran always wondered why those files lacked detailed maps of the conduit network. He climbed into the passage while the distant knocking faded into a soft, repetitive thud that throbbed like a pulse behind heavy fabric. The air grew colder as he descended, and his flashlight beam caught a rust-colored streak across the left wall that narrowed into thin scratches. The scratches ran parallel for several feet, then split into branching marks that looked frantic and uneven. He recorded the marks and estimated their age based on the flaking debris gathered below them. The dryness of the flakes suggested they had formed many years earlier, yet the upper edges looked freshly chipped, which confused him and made him tighten his grip on the recorder. He walked deeper as the floor leveled and met a small junction space supported by old steel beams that bent slightly inward. He almost stepped on a folded jacket placed neatly near the base of one beam. The fabric was sun-faded and stiff, yet held a faint patch that matched the logo used by track crews in the 70s. Ferran photographed every angle and whispered, "How did it stay dry this long?" even though the recorder picked up the question with a faint crackle. Another passage continued beyond the junction and narrowed into a wedge-shaped corridor that veered under the main tunnel. Ferran followed the path while watching for loose stone that might collapse under his weight. The corridor opened into a circular chamber carved roughly by crews who had once planned to expand drainage culverts, yet abandoned the project due to unstable rock conditions. He swung the flashlight slowly and saw a small pile of objects arranged in a careful ring. The objects included a broken lantern base, a warped set of pliers, and a metal tag that belonged to an older uniform design. None of the pieces looked recent. Yet a single tool lay in the center of the ring with clean edges and bright markings that indicated it had been used within the last week. He reached for the tool and paused when he felt vibrations under his boots that trembled through the chamber in short bursts. He checked his recorder and noted that the microphone captured a low, steady hum originating from the main tunnel. The hum pulsed like machinery, starting and stopping, despite no active equipment scheduled anywhere near this zone. He retreated to the junction and radioed the dispatcher with a brief description of the chamber and collected items. The dispatcher told him that the backup inspector was delayed due to a blocked crossing near the yard, which meant Ferran would need to remain at the site longer than expected. He felt uneasy and decided to exit the passage slowly while documenting each step. As he climbed upward, he heard a faint voice echo from deep below that sounded like a strained attempt to form a short warning. The syllables were unclear, yet carried enough urgency to speed his ascent. He emerged into the alcove and turned toward the main tunnel, where the hum had grown louder at a steady pace. His flashlight shook as he approached the mouth of the tunnel with long, careful strides. A shape moved near the center of the tracks where the darkness thickened. The shape flickered as if caught between the beam of his light and the shadows that clung to the walls. Ferran called out, asking if anyone needed assistance. The shape tilted slightly, then vanished as his beam passed across an empty stretch of rail. He repeated his call with firmer tone and waited for any response. He backed out of the tunnel and reached the open air where the gray sky offered familiar comfort. He steadied his breath and reviewed the footage on his recorder. The display showed faint distortions in the shape of a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel for 2 brief seconds before dissolving into static. The image remained too vague to confirm a person and could not be matched to any known worker silhouette. The second inspector arrived shortly after midday and followed Ferran into the alcove. They documented every detail, then sealed the cavity with reinforced plates ordered through an emergency maintenance request. Company officials later issued a short statement that the old cable routes had collapsed and created misleading impressions of deeper chambers. They ordered that the tunnel section be restricted until further geological checks were completed. Ferran never fully accepted the official explanation because his recorder held the voice fragment that carried a tone of warning rather than pain. Analysts reviewed the audio and concluded that the fragment likely came from echo bounce caused by shifting metal. Yet the cadence and pitch sounded too human and contained subtle dips that suggested controlled breath. Years later, Ferran kept the recorder locked in a metal drawer at his small apartment overlooking service yards. He sometimes played the fragment late at night when freight whistles traveled through the open windows. The voice always repeated the same unclear plea with a slow, trembling rhythm that matched the tapping he had heard on that morning. The quiet truth he often shared with trusted colleagues was simple. He believed that someone trapped deep under the tunnel had used the old cable routes to move toward the alcove, yet never reached the surface. He believed the ring of objects showed an attempt to gather tools for a climb that time eventually stopped. And he believed the final warning on the recording came from someone who wanted future workers to tread carefully in forgotten places where help might never arrive. Ferran understood that not all tunnels hide catastrophic secrets, and not all missing crew stories end with tragedy. Yet he also knew that silence in old service corridors often carries traces of lives that never found closure. When he passed the sealed alcove during later inspections, he paused for a moment of respect and continued down the line, carrying the recorder in his bag with steady, determined steps. The night guard heard footsteps, then saw the logbook. Security audio from the north wing captured footsteps after midnight. Later, the logbook showed an entry written when the building was supposed to be empty. In the spring of 2017, a night guard named Darlin Voigt reported for duty at a municipal archives facility. He was 46 years old and worked contract security after leaving a long career in warehouse supervision. The building stored decades of permits, property records, and sealed civil evidence in long concrete corridors. Darlin's goal every night was routine: complete patrols on schedule and document everything carefully. The facility closed to staff at 6 p.m. and reopened the following morning. After hours, Darlin was the only authorized person inside the building. Motion sensors covered stairwells and main hallways, but several storage wings required physical patrols. Those areas were quiet and dim, lit only by emergency fixtures mounted high on the walls. Just after 1 a.m., Darlin began his second patrol of the shift. He moved through the north wing, checking door seals and emergency lighting. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint smell of paper and dust. His footsteps echoed softly as he walked, familiar and predictable. Halfway down the records corridor, Darlin heard footsteps behind him. They were slow, measured, and clearly distinct from his own. He stopped immediately and turned around. The corridor behind him was empty. The sound stopped the moment he stopped. Darlin waited several seconds, listening closely. Nothing followed, not even an echo. He told himself it was sound reflection and continued forward. 10 steps later, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer and matched his pace exactly. When he slowed, they slowed. When he stopped, they stopped again. Darlin felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with exertion. He turned once more and scanned the corridor. There were no side doors open and no movement at either end. The emergency lights hummed quietly overhead. He keyed his radio and announced his location. Dispatch did not respond, which occasionally happened due to poor reception inside the building. He checked the nearest alarm panel, which showed no motion alerts. Everything appeared normal. Darlin completed the patrol without further noise and returned to the security desk. As required, he opened the paper logbook and recorded the patrol time. He noted hearing unexplained footsteps and attributed them to acoustics. He signed his name and closed the book. The hours passed quietly until just after 3 a.m. Darlin was seated at the desk reviewing paperwork when he heard the footsteps again. This time they came from the stairwell near the north wing. They sounded heavier, like boots striking concrete. He stood and listened. The footsteps moved across the floor above him, slow and deliberate. They lasted nearly a full minute before fading away. No alarms sounded and no sensors activated. Darlin checked the camera feed covering the stairwell. The screen showed an empty landing. No doors opened and no shadows passed. The system logs showed no recorded motion. He returned to the desk and opened the logbook again. Carefully, he wrote the time and location of the sound. He described the footsteps and noted their duration. He initialed the entry and left the book open briefly to dry the ink. By the end of the shift, nothing else occurred. Darlin locked up, completed his final report, and left the building at sunrise. He expected the night to be remembered only as an odd shift. He did not know the logbook would become the real problem. The next evening, Darlin returned for his shift, expecting questions but not confrontation. Before he could clock in, the day's supervisor asked him to step into her office. She was holding the logbook open on the desk, turned to the previous night. She asked why he had conducted an unscheduled patrol at 2:37 a.m. Darlin told her he had not left the desk at that time. He explained that he had been completing paperwork and monitoring cameras. The supervisor pointed to the page and asked him to read the entry aloud. Between his two entries was another patrol note written in his handwriting. It listed the north wing stairwell and mentioned footsteps heard with no visual contact. The wording used his usual abbreviations and spacing. It ended with the same closing phrase he always used. Darlin said clearly that he did not write it. He recognized the handwriting but could not remember making the entry. The supervisor asked if he could have forgotten due to fatigue. Darlin answered that he had been alert and seated at the desk then. Management initiated an internal review that same morning. Security footage from the desk camera was pulled for the exact time listed. The video showed Darlin seated, writing unrelated notes, and never leaving his chair. The timestamp matched the mysterious logbook entry precisely. They checked the stairwell camera next. It showed an empty concrete landing with no movement. No doors opened, and no lights changed. The motion sensor log showed no activity during that period. Darlin was asked to walk through his actions minute by minute. His account matched the video footage without gaps. There was no time window where he could have written the entry unnoticed. The logbook itself had never left the desk. The review expanded to archived security records. Older paper logbooks were pulled from storage. 2 previous guards had documented unexplained footsteps in the same north wing. In both cases, additional entries appeared between confirmed patrol times. One guard had written that he assumed he was overtired. The other noted confusion but never filed a formal complaint. Both men eventually left the position within months. No further action had been taken at the time. A handwriting specialist was consulted to examine the disputed entries. The analysis showed strong similarity to each guard's writing style. However, small inconsistencies appeared in pressure and letter alignment. It looked practiced but not fully natural. The specialist concluded the writing was not forged by another person. It also could not be confidently attributed to the guards themselves. The report used the phrase deliberate imitation without identified author. That conclusion unsettled everyone involved. Management considered mechanical explanations. They inspected ventilation systems for vibration that might move pages. They tested pens and ink flow under various conditions. None of the tests explained how a complete entry could appear. As a precaution, Darlin was reassigned to desk-only duties. Another guard was brought in to cover patrols temporarily. Both men reported hearing no further footsteps during that period. The building remained quiet. Despite that, the unexplained entry remained in the logbook. It could not be removed or disregarded. It was a written record of an action that no one could place. That made it a liability. Management scheduled a meeting to decide next steps. The decision would permanently change how the facility documented its nights. Management decided to eliminate the paper logbook entirely. Within a week, a digital logging system was installed at the security desk. Entries now required a personal login and automatic timestamps. Patrol confirmations were tied directly to motion sensors and cameras. The old logbooks were boxed and sealed for records retention. They were labeled and moved to an off-site storage facility. No pages were removed, and no annotations were added. The unexplained entry remained exactly where it had been written. Darlan completed his remaining shifts without incident. He never heard footsteps again after patrol duties were reassigned. Still, he avoided the North Wing whenever possible. The memory of the handwriting stayed with him. Several months later, an external audit reviewed archive security materials. The auditors flagged the sealed logbooks as irregular. They requested permission to review them for completeness. Management allowed access under supervision. During the review, one auditor noticed a pattern. Each unexplained entry appeared shortly after a guard reported hearing footsteps. The timing varied, but the sequence stayed consistent. Sound first, writing second. The auditors compared the language used in the entries. Each one mirrored the vocabulary and phrasing of the assigned guard. However, none included personal remarks or emotional notes. They read like routine observations stripped of context. One theory suggested unconscious writing during brief dissociative episodes. Another suggested deliberate hoaxing by an unknown party. Neither explanation fit all recorded facts. No one could explain how entries appeared while guards were on camera. After the audit, the logbooks were returned to storage. They were marked as reviewed and closed. No recommendation was made to destroy them. They remained part of the facility record. Years later, the archives facility underwent renovation. The North Wing stairwell was reconfigured and sealed. Motion sensors were upgraded and coverage expanded. Security reports from that point forward were uneventful. Darlan eventually left contract security and took a daytime job. He avoided discussing his time at the archives. When asked, he described it as quiet but unsettling. He never claimed to know what caused the entries. The sealed logbooks are still stored with other administrative records. They are rarely requested and almost never read. The unexplained writing remains preserved. It documents patrols that officially never happened.